Greetings, time travelers, and welcome to another edition of Old News, the podcast that lets you relive the past 1 year at a time. Today, we're diving back to 1942. Here we go. This year was critical for establishing the Allied grand strategy in World War II, formalized across several high-level meetings between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The first was the Arcadia Conference in January, followed by the Second Washington Conference in June, and the Casablanca Conference in French Morocco in January 1943. The cornerstone of their planning was the Germany First principle, meaning the war in Europe against Hitler was the primary focus, while the Pacific War against Japan would remain a holding action. To execute this plan, the Allies established the Combined Chiefs of Staff, a unified military body ensuring seamless UK and US coordination. They opted for Operation Torch, the joint invasion of North Africa, as the first major offensive step, aiming to clear the Mediterranean and prepare the ground for attacking the Axis soft underbelly in southern Europe. The plan was to squeeze the Axis from the edges, starting from the south rather than a direct suicidal dash across the English Channel in the northwest. Also in January 1942, a group of high-ranking Nazi officials met at a lakeside villa in Wannsee, South Berlin, to discuss what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. This wasn't a meeting of soldiers in muddy boots, but of lawyers, doctors, and civil servants, chaired by Heinrich Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich. It was here that the Holocaust was turned into a state-managed logistics project. Under Himmler's oversight was the Schutzstaffel, SS for short, the protection squad, that had grown into a monstrous state within a state, controlling its own factories, its own judicial system, and a vast network of slave labor. They transitioned from the concentration camp, originally designed in 1933 for political labor and intimidation, to the extermination camp, designed specifically for industrial murder. While the early years of the camp system saw deaths in the tens of thousands, 1942 saw the murder rate surge to 2.7 million people in a single year. With the opening of death factories like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, it became the deadliest year of the Holocaust. Their new gas chambers enabled the transition from a prison system, killing people by starvation and mass shooting operations, to processing plants. At the height of this Operation Reinhardt, the Nazis were murdering, upwards of 15,000 human beings every day. This horror was made possible by a calculated legal loophole. The Nazis didn't simply ignore the law, they rewrote it. Using the Reichstag fire decree, they suspended civil liberties and created a system of protective custody. This allowed the SS to bypass the court system entirely, meaning a prisoner could be disappeared forever without a trial, a lawyer, or even a specific charge. It was the total erosion of due process. A warning to us today that when a government begins to treat legal rights as optional for certain groups, the shield that protects everyone is effectively destroyed. Perhaps most disturbing was the normalization of this system. These camps weren't always hidden in deep forests. Many were built in plain view, near major rail hubs or on the outskirts of cities. This was intentional. They served as a visible warning to the public, a physical manifestation of what happened to enemies of the state. By 1942, the sight of cattle cars moving through civilian stations had become part of the background noise of life in occupied Europe. The strongman world had successfully reduced human beings to units or material to be processed and discarded. This remains hauntingly relevant today. It serves as a permanent reminder that the most terrifying evil isn't always found in the heat of a riot, but in the quiet, efficient paperwork of a government office that has abandoned its humanity. When society accepts the slow boil of dehumanization and watches in silence as others are stripped of their legal personhood, the road to the death factory is already being paved. Meanwhile, on the battlefields, there were dramatic defeats and desperate retaliation. In the Pacific, the devastating momentum of the Japanese offensive culminated in the fall of Bataan in April, resulting in the surrender of over 75,000 American and Filipino troops. The subsequent Bataan Death March was a horrific 60-mile forced march under sweltering heat where prisoners, already starved and exhausted, were subject to savage physical abuse, starvation, and execution by their captors. Thousands died during the march, but the suffering did not end there. Thousands more perished in the horrific prison camps due to disease, malnutrition, and continued cruelty, making the event one of the war's worst atrocities. This early loss stunned the United States. However, just 2 weeks later, the U.S. launched its audacious reply, the Doolittle raid, a surprise bombing run on Tokyo carried out by 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet aircraft carrier. The raid was essentially a high-risk, one-way trip. The B-25s, never designed to take off from or land on a carrier, lacked the fuel range to return to the carrier or reach safe Allied territory. The crews, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, knew they faced a near-suicide mission, having to parachute out or crash land over mainland China. While militarily small, the raid provided a crucial psychological boost to Allied morale and demonstrated that the Japanese homeland was vulnerable. And amazingly, most of the bomber crews were rescued among Chinese resistance fighters. Soon thereafter, the momentum of the war shifted dramatically. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy pulled off a miraculous victory at the Battle of Midway in June, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and effectively crippling their carrier fleet and halting their advance across the ocean. The tides were also turning against the Axis powers elsewhere. The Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa saw British General Bernard Montgomery defeat Rommel's Africa Corps, forcing a German retreat. And on the Eastern Front, the meat grinder of Stalingrad began, a brutal, decisive siege that marked the turning point against Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. The war also touched the very top of the British establishment in another shocking way. 1942 marked the death of Prince George, the Duke of Kent. The younger brother of King George VI, the Duke was a glamorous and controversial figure, a style icon known for a wild youth who had settled into the role of a dedicated Royal Air Force officer. He spent the early years of the war boosting morale by visiting RAF stations and factories, often on highly publicized tours. On August 25th, he boarded a short Sunderland flying boat, a massive, lumbering, luxurious flying hotel, headed for Iceland on a morale-boosting mission. Tragically, the plane veered off course in heavy fog and crashed into a hillside in Scotland. 14 of the 15 men on board were killed, including the Duke. He was the first member of the royal family to die on active service in over 450 years. His death stunned the British public, adding a layer of royal tragedy to a year already filled with grief. However, the crash immediately spawned intense conspiracy theories because the official inquiry was unusually brief and its results were quickly sealed. The most persistent and dramatic of these theories suggested the Duke was not on a simple morale-boosting tour, but rather on a secret, unauthorized peace mission, perhaps carrying critical documents to neutral Sweden or Iceland to meet with German intermediaries. Or even that his plane was sabotaged or shot down by Allied forces to prevent a secret deal from taking place. The mystery and secrecy only enhanced the tragedy, the records of which are still largely unavailable. His title was immediately passed to his 6-year-old son, Prince Edward, who would go on to hold the position for over 80 years, the longest duration of any duke in British history. Back on the American home front, there was an ugly side to the struggle for global freedom. In February, fueled by war hysteria and racial prejudice, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The U.S. government used the 1940 census data to locate Japanese American families, and the order authorized the forced incarceration of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, into desolate internment camps. Families were given only days to sell their homes and businesses, often for a fraction of their value, before being tagged with numbers and shipped to barbed wire relocation centers in California and Arizona. Ironically, despite being initially classified as enemy aliens, 10,000 young men from these internment camps would soon volunteer to prove their loyalty. By early 1943, the government began forming the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a Japanese-American unit that went on to fight in Italy and France, famously rescuing 200 survivors in the Lost Battalion in 1944, while suffering 800 casualties of their own. This team became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. The injustice of 1942 eventually resulted in a formal government apology and reparations in 1988, which cited a failure of political leadership. Meanwhile, factories across the U.S. and Allied nations shifted to round-the-clock war production, churning out tanks, planes, and ships at unprecedented rates. With millions of men serving overseas, women stepped into roles once reserved for men, working as welders, machinists, and assembly line workers. The "We Can Do It" poster and the hit song Rosie the Riveter captured the spirit of determination and empowerment as women proved indispensable to the war effort and forever changed the American workforce. Rationing became a fact of life, with families receiving coupons for everything from sugar and meat to gasoline and rubber. Victory gardens sprang up in backyards and vacant lots as citizens grew their own vegetables to support the war effort. War bonds were sold in record numbers, and scrap drives collected metal, rubber, and even cooking fat for military use. While America was worried about Japanese spies, it was the Germans that were the literal threat on the home front. Hitler had a deep, almost obsessive respect and fear of American industrialization. He had studied the American assembly line and Henry Ford's mass production techniques. He knew that if the U.S. was given enough time to fully convert its civilian car plants into tank and plane factories, the sheer volume of steel and engines would eventually drown the Third Reich. Hitler also respected Ford as a fellow anti-Semitist. More about that in episode 1938. So Hitler launched Operation Pastorius to sabotage American factories in 1942. He wasn't just attacking a military rival. He was attacking an industrial system he had once studied and a man he had once considered a kindred spirit. But his logic was simple. If he couldn't stop the ships in the Atlantic, he would break the machines in the Midwest. He wanted to shatter the American spirit by showing that the invincible American factory was vulnerable. He personally ordered a mission to strike the literal nervous system of the U.S. industry. The operation sent 8 English-speaking Germans across the Atlantic in U-boats. They were divided into 2 teams. One landed under the cover of fog on Long Island, and the other on the sun-drenched shores of Florida near Jacksonville. They didn't come to fight. They came to destroy. They carried boxes of explosives, timers, and enough cash to fund a 2-year campaign of sabotage against targets like the Pennsylvania Railroad, aluminum plants in Illinois, hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls, and even the New York City water system. The mission only failed because the leader of the Long Island team, George Dosh, had a secret plan. He wasn't there to destroy America. He was there to defect. He actually hated the Nazi regime and saw this operation as opportunities for both retribution and a return home to America, where he previously lived for almost 20 years. And he wasn't the only one. He came to find out his teammate, Ernest Berger, also had a complicated past, including time in a Nazi concentration camp during which his wife was so harassed by the Gestapo that she had a miscarriage. So they mutually agreed to sabotage the sabotage. Within days of arriving to the U.S., Dosh traveled to Washington, D.C. and turned himself and the others in, dumping nearly $84,000, which would be almost $1.6 million today, in bribe money on an FBI desk to prove he wasn't a crackpot. By late June, all 8 men were captured. President Roosevelt, wanting to send a clear message and hide how easily the Coast Guard had been bypassed, and how John Edgar Hoover's FBI was actually lucky, not brilliant. The Guard was roaming the beach and encountered the first team, but they escaped. And the submarine ran aground on a sandbar, witnessed by a dozen people, but also eventually got away when the tide came up. So anyway, FDR ordered a secret military tribunal, the first of its kind since the Civil War. Unlike a civilian trial, A military tribunal is a court run entirely by the armed forces. There's no jury of your peers. Instead, a panel of high-ranking military officers act as both judge and jury. The rules of evidence are much looser. Hearsay is often allowed, and the proceedings are usually held in total secrecy. FDR chose this path for 3 reasons: speed, secrecy, and the death penalty. Under civilian law, attempted sabotage might have only meant a prison sentence. But under the military's Articles of War, being an enemy combatant caught out of uniform was a capital offense. The defendants petitioned for habeas corpus, the right to be brought before a judge. And this 1942 case, known as ex parte Quirin, went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that the president did indeed have the power to bypass civilian courts during wartime. It's a legal precedent that still echoes today, as it formed the foundation for how the U.S. handles unlawful combatants in modern conflicts. By August, 6 of the 8 men had been executed by electric chair. The 2 defectors, Dash and Berger, actually expected to be treated by the U.S. as heroes and provided intel to help prevent future sabotage missions. Although they escaped the death penalty, they were considered full criminals and given life in prison, but pardoned by Truman 6 years later. This event sent shockwaves throughout the country, fueling the spy fever and paranoia that made many Americans look at their neighbors with suspicion. It provides a chilling context for why the public so readily accepted the unconstitutional internment of Japanese Americans. The government used the threat of enemy within to justify its darkest domestic policies. In innovation, the military needed a waterproof tape to seal ammunition cases. A mother of 2 Navy sailors, Vesta Stout, suggested a fabric-based tape. It was originally called duct tape because it shed water like a duck's feathers. It was also originally army green to match the crates and uniforms. When the soldiers came home, they brought the tape with them, praising its ability to fix everything from broken Jeep axles to torn tents. But it wasn't until the late 40s and 50s, during the American housing boom, that the construction industry realized this tape was perfect for sealing joints in heating and air conditioning ducts. So to match the color, the manufacturers changed the color to silver gray we recognize today. Ironically, duct tape is actually terrible for ducts. The rubber-based adhesive eventually dries out and fails due to the heat cycles of a furnace. Meanwhile, under the breaches of Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, physicist Enrico Fermi achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in an experimental pile known as Chicago Pile 1, and the beginning of the secret Manhattan Project and atomic age. And Spam, which existed since 1937, became a global phenomenon in 1942 as a war meat that didn't need refrigeration. It became a staple for soldiers and a symbol of American lend-lease to the Soviets and British. Culture and entertainment also offered moments of escape and inspiration. Hollywood produced patriotic films like Yankee Doodle Dandy and Miss Miniver, both of which won Academy Awards, inspiring Allied resistance. Bing Crosby's White Christmas, introduced in the film Holiday Inn, became an instant classic and a source of comfort for soldiers and families longing for home. Comic books also soared in popularity, with Superman, Batman, and Captain America fighting the Axis enemy on the page. The Captain actually first hit stands just months before Pearl Harbor and showed him punching Hitler in the face. It was a controversial, highly political move that showed how pop culture was mobilizing for war before the government was. And fashion reflected material shortages of the time. After Pearl Harbor, silk was diverted entirely to parachutes. This led to the nylon shortage, and American women began painting liquid stockings on their legs using eyeliner to draw a seam up the back of their calves to mimic hosiery. So that's 1942, a year of sacrifice, adaptation, and the forging of new roles and identities. The world was battered but determined, and the events of this year set the stage for the turning points to come. As we say, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.